They said I couldn't help with my own sister's fundraiser. Too busy, they assumed. Probably didn't know the first thing about organizing school events. Then the principal walked into that gymnasium and everything changed. When she called out Colonel Rodriguez, the room went dead silent, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the scholarship program I'd been quietly funding for the past decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Roosevelt Elementary's gymnasium buzzed with that particular frequency that makes your teeth ache, casting everything in a harsh, institutional glow that turned everyone's skin slightly green. The smell hit me as soon as I pushed through the double doors. That uniquely American combination of industrial floor wax, decades of childhood sweat, and the faint sweetness of frosting that had been carried in on dozens of plastic containers. It was Tuesday evening, and the parent volunteers had transformed the basketball court into what could generously be called organized chaos. Folding tables lined the walls, each one draped with wrinkled tablecloths in the school colors of blue and gold, though some had clearly seen better days. The tables groaned under the weight of homemade cupcakes, cookies shaped like everything from dinosaurs to graduation caps, and elaborate cake constructions that probably cost more in ingredients than they'd raise in sales. I stood just inside the entrance, taking in the scene with the automatic assessment that had become second nature over the years. Exit routes, main doors behind me, emergency exits on either side, one by the stage that was partially blocked by stacked chairs. Foot traffic patterns, bottleneck forming near the popular cookie table, clear lanes down the center, congregation point by the coffee station that someone had optimistically set up using the school's ancient percolator. My clothes marked me immediately as an outsider in this world of suburban school politics. Dark jeans that had been practical for years, a plain gray sweater that prioritized comfort over fashion, and sneakers that were built for walking rather than making statements. No designer handbag, no artfully applied makeup, no jewelry beyond a simple watch with a worn leather band. I looked like what I was, someone who had learned that blending in was often more valuable than standing out. The volunteer mothers had already sorted themselves into their familiar hierarchies, and I could read the social landscape as clearly as any tactical briefing I'd ever received. The inner circle clustered around Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, whose blonde highlights caught the gymnasium lighting in a way that seemed almost calculated. She wore a pink blazer that probably cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month, and her voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of organizing charity galas and PTA fundraisers. Beside her stood Jennifer Chen, whose perfect posture and color-coordinated outfit suggested someone who approached volunteer work with the same precision she brought to her law practice. Her daughter was in the same grade as my niece Emma, and I'd seen her at enough school events to recognize the way she commanded attention without ever raising her voice. The third member of what I'd privately dubbed the leadership triumvirate was Susan Martinez, a real estate agent whose business cards seemed to multiply like rabbits at every school function. She had that particular smile that politicians perfect, warm enough to seem genuine, sharp enough to cut through opposition when necessary. They were the ones who made things happen at Roosevelt Elementary, the ones who turned ideas into action and somehow managed to extract impressive sums of money from reluctant parents for causes ranging from new playground equipment to upgraded computer labs. I respected their efficiency, even if I found their methods occasionally exhausting to watch. I'd come tonight because my sister Maria had specifically asked me to stop by. Emma was her youngest, and this bake sale was raising money for the 6th grade class trip to Washington, D.C. Maria had been volunteering for weeks, staying up late to perfect her contribution to tonight's offerings, a batch of tres leches cupcakes that represented hours of experimentation in her kitchen. But Maria was also working double shifts at the hospital this week, covering for a colleague who'd come down with pneumonia, which meant she couldn't be here to see how her cupcakes performed in the competitive arena of elementary school fundraising. She'd asked me to stop by, take some pictures, maybe buy a few things to support the cause. "Just blend in," she'd said, with the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly how impossible that request was. "Try not to reorganize anything." The comment had been meant as a joke, but it carried enough truth to make us both laugh. I had a reputation in our family for what Maria diplomatically called efficiency improvement suggestions, and what our brother Carlos less diplomatically called bossy interference. It wasn't intentional. I'd simply spent too many years in environments where inefficiency could have serious consequences, and old habits were proving remarkably difficult to break. I made my way toward the center of the activity, nodding politely to parents I recognized from previous school events. Most of them knew me as Emma's aunt, the one who showed up occasionally but never volunteered for committees or signed up for classroom helper duties. I could see the curiosity in their expressions, the way they tried to place me in their mental catalog of school community members. Mrs. Rodriguez, I presumed, the mysterious relative who somehow always seemed to have other commitments when volunteer opportunities arose. They'd probably classified me as one of those family members who cared enough to attend events, but not enough to actually contribute to the work that made them possible. The assumption wasn't entirely unfair. I did have other commitments, though they weren't the kind I could easily explain at elementary school fundraisers. My calendar was filled with meetings that required security clearances and conversations that were recorded in files most people would never see. My work schedule was dictated by factors that had nothing to do with traditional business hours and everything to do with the unpredictable nature of global stability. But tonight, I was just Emma's aunt, here to buy some overpriced baked goods and take pictures that would make my sister smile during her 15-minute break between patient rounds. I approached the main table, where Patricia Whitmore was holding court with a clipboard that seemed to serve as both organizational tool and symbol of her authority. She looked up as I approached, and I could see her mental gears turning as she tried to place me in the context of Roosevelt Elementary's social ecosystem. "Oh, hello," she said with a smile that was professionally warm but personally distant. "I don't think we've been formally introduced. I'm Patricia Whitmore, PTA president." "Elena Rodriguez," I replied, extending my hand, "Emma Martinez's aunt." Recognition flickered across her features, followed quickly by something that might have been disappointment. She'd probably been hoping I was a new parent with fresh energy and unexploited volunteer potential. "Of course. Emma's such a sweet girl. Maria talks about you all the time." Patricia's tone carried that particular inflection that suggested she was being polite while simultaneously categorizing me as a minor player in the evening's activities.
"She asked me to stop by since she couldn't make it tonight," I explained. "Double shifts at the hospital." "Oh, we completely understand," Jennifer Chen interjected, appearing at Patricia's shoulder with the kind of timing that suggested she'd been monitoring the conversation. "Healthcare workers are so busy. We're just grateful when family members can represent." The word represent hung in the air with subtle implications. I was here as a substitute, a second-choice participant who was better than nothing but certainly not expected to contribute anything meaningful to the evening's success. "The cupcakes look amazing," I said, gesturing toward the display where Maria's Tres Leches creations sat in neat rows. She was experimenting with the recipe for weeks. "They do look lovely," Susan Martinez agreed, though her attention was already drifting toward a family that had just entered and appeared to have deeper pockets than mine. "We're hoping to raise enough tonight to cover the transportation costs for the Washington trip. It's quite expensive, but such an important educational opportunity." I nodded appropriately and began examining the various offerings, noting the impressive range of homemade contributions. Someone had clearly spent considerable time on an elaborate castle cake complete with fondant turrets. Another table featured cookies decorated with remarkable artistic skill, each one a tiny masterpiece of edible art. But as I moved through the space, I couldn't help noticing inefficiencies that made my professionally trained brain itch with the desire to suggest improvements. The payment system was creating bottlenecks. One volunteer with a cash box trying to handle all transactions while lines backed up at popular tables. The coffee station was positioned in a way that created cross-traffic conflicts. The most expensive items were placed in corners where foot traffic was lightest. I caught myself mentally redesigning the entire layout for optimal flow and revenue generation, then remembered Maria's warning about not reorganizing anything. This wasn't my operation to optimize, and suggesting changes would probably earn me a reputation as the interfering relative who couldn't mind her own business. Instead, I focused on playing my assigned role: supportive family member, making appropriate purchases, and offering encouraging comments about the impressive community effort. "This is quite an operation," I said to Patricia as I returned to the main table with my arms full of carefully selected items. "You've done an amazing job organizing everything." Patricia's expression brightened at the compliment, though I could see her simultaneously calculating whether my purchases were sufficient to mark me as a serious contributor or merely someone going through the motions. Well, it's all about teamwork. Though I have to say, it would be wonderful to have more hands to help with the actual organizing. Events like this require so much coordination. The comment was clearly an invitation to volunteer for future activities, delivered with the kind of practiced casualness that suggested Patricia had perfected this particular recruiting technique over years of PTA leadership. "I'm sure they do," I agreed diplomatically, placing my selections on the table and reaching for my wallet. The logistics must be incredibly complex. Jennifer Chen looked up from her own clipboard, where she'd been tracking sales figures with the precision of someone conducting financial analysis. "You'd be surprised how many moving parts are involved in something that looks this simple. We spend weeks planning everything from table arrangements to volunteer schedules." "Coordination is definitely challenging," I said, handing over cash for my purchases. "Getting all the pieces to work together smoothly?" Something in my tone must have suggested more familiarity with logistical complexity than they expected, because Patricia's attention sharpened slightly. "Do you have experience with event planning?" "Some," I replied, carefully. "Different context, though." "Oh, what field are you in?" It was a perfectly reasonable question, the kind of casual inquiry that happened thousands of times at school events across the country. But it was also the kind of question that always required careful navigation, especially in settings where the truth might create more complications than connections. "Government work," I said, using the deliberately vague phrasing that had become automatic over the years. "Nothing too exciting." The response was designed to satisfy casual curiosity while discouraging deeper investigation. Most people heard government work and immediately assumed something bureaucratic and boring: paper-pushing duties in anonymous office buildings that processed forms and filed reports. "Ah," Patricia said with a kind of polite nod that suggested her interest had already moved on to more promising conversational territory. "Well, we certainly appreciate you supporting Emma's class tonight." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. I'd been categorized as a minor figure, caring family member with a boring job who could be counted on for modest financial contributions but was not likely to become a significant player in the school community's power structure. I completed my purchases and moved away from the main table, partly to avoid further well-meaning recruitment attempts, and partly to observe the evening's operations from a different angle. The gymnasium was filling up as more families arrived, and the noise level was rising accordingly. Conversations blending into a comfortable hum, punctuated by occasional laughter and the excited voices of children who had been allowed to accompany their parents. Near the basketball hoop at the far end of the gym, I noticed a small cluster of fathers who had apparently been assigned child-watching duties while their wives handled the serious business of fundraising. One of them, a tall man in an expensive polo shirt, was explaining to his companions why the school's fundraising approach was fundamentally flawed. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard in corporate boardrooms, and his gestures suggested he was outlining a comprehensive strategy for improvement. "The problem is inefficiency," he was saying as I moved within earshot. "Look at this setup. They've got bottlenecks everywhere, no real system for inventory management, and they're not maximizing revenue per square foot. Basic business principles would solve half these problems." His companions nodded with the kind of agreement that suggested they were either genuinely impressed by his analysis or had learned that disagreeing with him wasn't worth the effort. I found myself pausing to listen, curious about whether his observations matched my own mental notes on improvements.
"They need better traffic flow management," he continued, warming to his theme. "And the pricing strategy is all wrong. They're leaving money on the table by not using psychological pricing techniques. Plus, the volunteer deployment is completely random. No clear chain of command, no specialization of duties. He wasn't entirely wrong, which made his tone all the more irritating. His observations were reasonably accurate, but delivered with the particular arrogance of someone who assumed his business expertise automatically translated to every other domain of human activity. "These PTA ladies mean well," he added with a condescending chuckle, "but they're essentially running this like a hobby instead of treating it like the serious fundraising operation it needs to be." The comment hit me wrong on multiple levels. First, because it dismissed the considerable volunteer effort that had made the evening possible. Second, because it assumed that success in one arena automatically qualified someone to critique efforts in completely different contexts. And third, because it carried exactly the kind of casual sexism that I'd encountered in various forms throughout my professional life. I was debating whether to engage with his analysis when a small crisis erupted at the dessert table nearest to us. A toddler, apparently overwhelmed by the combination of sugar fumes and gymnasium acoustics, had achieved a spectacular meltdown that involved both impressive volume and what appeared to be a systematic attempt to overturn every container within reach. The child's mother, a young woman who looked like she'd already been stretched to her limit before the evening began, was trying to manage both damage control and emotional regulation while simultaneously apologizing to everyone within a 15-foot radius. The volunteer manning that particular table, an elderly woman who'd probably been handling school fundraisers since before I was born, was making valiant efforts to help. But the situation was rapidly escalating beyond what two people could handle effectively. Without really thinking about it, I found myself moving toward the commotion. Not to take charge, that would violate every instinct I developed about maintaining low profiles in civilian settings, but to provide whatever assistance might be needed without creating additional complications. The mother looked up as I approached, her eyes carrying the particular mix of exhaustion and embarrassment that comes with managing small children in public spaces. "I'm so sorry," she said, trying to gather scattered napkins while simultaneously preventing her son from achieving his apparent goal of climbing inside one of the cake boxes. "He's usually not like this." "No worries at all," I replied, crouching down to retrieve napkins that had scattered across the floor. Big rooms can be overwhelming. It was true enough, though my experience with overwhelmed individuals usually involved different contexts and significantly higher stakes. But the basic principles of crisis management were surprisingly transferable. Stay calm, focus on immediate priorities, address root causes rather than symptoms. "Here," I said to the toddler, offering him a napkin to hold. "Want to help clean up?" Sometimes the simplest redirection strategies worked best, regardless of the setting. Give someone a concrete task that made them feel useful rather than problematic, and you could often shift the entire dynamic of a difficult situation. The little boy looked at me with the kind of intense focus that toddlers reserve for adults who seem to take them seriously. He accepted the napkin and began dabbing at the table with exaggerated care, his earlier distress apparently forgotten in the satisfaction of having an important job to do. "You're a natural," the mother said, relief evident in her voice as the situation shifted from crisis to manageable challenge. "Do you have kids?" "No," I replied, helping to restack containers that had been knocked askew. "But I've had some experience with crisis management." It was an understatement that bordered on absurd, but it seemed to satisfy her curiosity while avoiding details that would require more extensive explanation. The elderly volunteer, whose name tag identified her as Mrs. Thompson, was watching our efficient damage control with obvious approval. "Some people just know how to handle situations," she said with a smile. "You must work with children." "Different kind of crisis management," I said diplomatically, finishing the napkin collection and checking to make sure nothing had been seriously damaged. Mrs. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, though I could see questions forming in her expression. Before she could pursue them, however, the gymnasium's main doors opened to admit a new wave of families, and her attention shifted to welcoming the latest arrivals. The toddler crisis had been resolved so smoothly that most people in the gymnasium probably hadn't even noticed it happening. But I could see that my brief intervention had been observed by several volunteers, including Patricia Whitmore, who was watching me with the kind of speculative attention that suggested she was reassessing her earlier categorization. I was considering whether to make a graceful exit before attracting any more attention when I heard my name being called from across the room. Not my first name, which might have been Emma or Maria looking for me, but my full name, delivered in a tone that carried unmistakable authority and more than a little surprise. Colonel Rodriguez? Elena Rodriguez? The voice cut through the gymnasium's ambient noise like a blade through silk, carrying clearly enough that conversations at nearby tables paused as people turned to see who was being addressed. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that always accompanied unexpected recognition in civilian settings, the automatic assessment of whether this was a situation that required immediate departure or could be managed through careful engagement. Principal Dr. Sharon Matthews was standing near the gymnasium's main entrance, having apparently just arrived for what was probably a routine check on the evening's fundraising activities. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested years of managing both educational challenges and community politics. Her expression showed the unmistakable signs of recognition mixed with something that looked like genuine pleasure. The title she'd used hung in the air like a dropped bomb, creating ripples of surprised attention that spread outward from where I stood. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they definitely shifted as people processed the unexpected information that the quiet woman in unremarkable clothes apparently held military rank significant enough to warrant that particular form of address. Patricia Whitmore's clipboard had gone completely still in her hands, and Jennifer Chen was staring at me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for solving complex legal puzzles. Even the cluster of fathers near the basketball hoop had gone quiet, their earlier conversation about business efficiency apparently forgotten in light of this new development. Dr. Matthews was approaching with the confident stride of someone who'd navigated similar social terrain many times before, and I could see that she was genuinely pleased to see me, though probably not entirely surprised. Principal networks in this district were tight-knit, and information traveled efficiently through official channels, especially when it concerned community members with potentially valuable connections. Dr. Matthews was approaching with the confident stride of someone who'd navigated similar social terrain many times before, and I could see that she was genuinely pleased to see me, though probably not entirely surprised. Principal networks in this district were tight-knit, and information traveled efficiently through official channels, especially when it concerned community members with potentially valuable connections. Dr. Matthews was approaching with the confident stride of someone who'd navigated similar social terrain many times before, and I could see that she was genuinely pleased to see me, though probably not entirely surprised. Principal networks in this district were tight-knit, and information traveled efficiently through official channels, especially when it concerned community members with potentially valuable connections. I had perhaps 30 seconds before she reached me. 30 seconds to decide how to handle a situation that was about to shift every assumption that had been made about my presence at Roosevelt Elementary's fundraising event. The evening that had begun as a simple show of family support was clearly about to become something more complicated. "Dr. Matthews," I said, extending my hand as she approached. "Good to see you." "The pleasure is entirely mine," she replied, accepting the handshake with the kind of firm grip that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with people who valued directness over social pleasantries. "I had no idea you were connected to our Roosevelt Elementary community." The conversation was happening in the middle of the gymnasium, surrounded by parents and volunteers who were trying to appear busy with their own activities while obviously straining to overhear every word. I could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, dozens of curious gazes trying to piece together information that would explain how the quiet woman they'd barely noticed had suddenly become the center of the evening's most interesting development. "My niece Emma is in 6th grade, I explained, keeping my voice level despite the growing audience. "Maria Martinez's daughter." "Ah, of course." Dr. Matthews's expression brightened with genuine warmth. "Emma's such a wonderful student. And Maria speaks of you often, though she's always been quite modest about your background." The word background was delivered with subtle emphasis that suggested Dr. Matthews knew considerably more about my professional history than she was saying in present company, which meant this conversation was about to become even more complicated than I'd anticipated. "Maria tends to focus on her own work," I said diplomatically. "Hospital administration keeps her busy enough." "Indeed it does, but I suspect she's being modest about more than just her own accomplishments." Dr. Matthews glanced around the gymnasium, taking in the curious faces and paused conversations. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion in my office. I'd love to hear more about how you've been spending your time since your retirement." The word retirement was another carefully chosen term, one that acknowledged my military background without providing specific details that might complicate an already delicate social situation. But even that subtle acknowledgement was enough to confirm what everyone within earshot had already begun to suspect, that the evening's assumptions about Emma's unremarkable aunt had been fundamentally incorrect. Before I could respond to Dr. Matthews' invitation, Patricia Whitmore approached with the determined stride of someone who decided that social conventions required immediate clarification of the situation unfolding in her carefully organized fundraising event. "I'm sorry," she said, with a smile that was polite but unmistakably demanding. "Did I hear correctly that you're Colonel Rodriguez?" The question was delivered with the kind of bright curiosity that made it impossible to ignore without seeming deliberately evasive. Patricia had positioned herself at an angle that created a small conversation triangle, effectively claiming her right to participate in whatever revelation was about to unfold. Dr. Matthews looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly leaving the decision about disclosure entirely in my hands. She understood the complexities that came with military backgrounds in civilian settings, and she wasn't going to force any explanations that I wasn't prepared to provide. I found myself standing at one of those moments that occasionally arise in life, where the careful boundaries between different aspects of your identity suddenly converge in ways you hadn't anticipated. The simple evening of family support that I'd planned was about to become something entirely different, and there was no graceful way to avoid the transformation. The gymnasium had grown noticeably quieter around us, conversations continuing but at lower volumes that suggested everyone was straining to hear how this unexpected situation would resolve itself. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was happening, their attention drawn to the cluster of adults who were clearly engaged in a discussion that carried more weight than typical fundraising small talk. I looked at Dr. Matthews, whose expression conveyed both understanding and gentle encouragement. She'd obviously connected some dots about my background, and her reference to retirement suggested she knew enough about my service record to understand that this conversation had implications beyond simple military courtesy. Then I looked at Patricia Whitmore, whose curiosity was practically radiating from her perfectly styled exterior. She was the kind of person who thrived on community connections and social information, someone who would undoubtedly share whatever she learned with the extensive network of parents and volunteers who looked to her for leadership in school-related matters. The decision I made in the next few seconds would determine how the rest of the evening unfolded, and probably how future school events would go as well. I could deflect, minimize, and try to return to the anonymous family member role I'd planned to maintain. Or I could acknowledge the reality that my attempt at invisibility had already failed and handle the situation with the same directness I'd learned to apply to most other challenges. The choice, as it turned out, was about to be made for me. The moment stretched like a held breath before I made my decision. There was no point in pretending anymore. Dr. Matthews clearly knew exactly who I was, and attempting to deflect would only create more questions than it answered. "Yes," I said, simply, meeting Patricia's gaze directly. "I'm Colonel Rodriguez, retired." The words landed in the gymnasium like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of surprised murmurs that spread outward in concentric circles. Patricia's perfectly composed expression wavered for just a moment, though professional politeness reasserted itself. Though I could see her mind racing to recalibrate everything she thought she knew about the evening's social dynamics. Jennifer Chen had abandoned all pretense of working on her sales figures and was staring at me with the kind of focused attention she probably reserved for cross-examining witnesses. Susan Martinez had actually taken a step closer, as if physical proximity might help her better assess this unexpected development in what had been a routine community fundraiser. "Army?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was trying to process information that didn't fit her existing frameworks.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That's correct. Dr. Matthews moved slightly closer, and I could see that she was enjoying this revelation considerably more than I was. "Colonel Rodriguez has been quite modest about her service record," she said with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she was aware of details that hadn't yet been shared. Though I suppose that's typical for officers of her caliber. The phrase "officers of her caliber" hung in the air with obvious implications that extended far beyond standard military courtesy. Dr. Matthews wasn't just acknowledging my rank, she was suggesting that my background included accomplishments worthy of particular recognition. "What branch of service?" Jennifer Chen asked, her legal training apparently compelling her to gather facts in some systematic order. "Military intelligence," I replied, using the deliberately broad categorization that was technically accurate while avoiding specifics that might lead to more complex conversations. "How long did you serve?" This from Susan Martinez, whose real estate background had probably taught her to ask direct questions when evaluating new information. 22 years. The number carried weight in military circles, representing more than just time served. 22 years meant career commitment, meant rising through ranks based on performance rather than just persistence, meant accumulating experiences that most people would never encounter. "And you retired as a full colonel?" Patricia's question carried the tone of someone who was beginning to understand that her initial assessment of the evening's participants had been significantly flawed. "I did." Dr. Matthews was watching this exchange with obvious satisfaction, like someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment to unfold. "Colonel Rodriguez is being characteristically modest," she said, addressing the growing circle of interested parents who had gradually moved closer as word of the conversation spread through the gymnasium. "Her service record is quite remarkable." I felt the familiar discomfort that always accompanied public discussion of my military background in civilian settings. Not shame, I was proud of my service and the work I'd done, but the translation between military accomplishments and civilian understanding was never straightforward, and it often led to assumptions and expectations that were difficult to navigate. "What kind of work did you do?" This question came from one of the fathers who had drifted over from the basketball hoop area, his earlier confidence about fundraising efficiency apparently forgotten in light of this new dynamic. "Strategic operations," I said, using another deliberately vague phrase that satisfied curiosity without providing details that might require security clearances to discuss properly. Dr. Matthews stepped into the brief silence that followed. "Perhaps what's most relevant to tonight's gathering is the work Colonel Rodriguez has been doing since her retirement," she said, with the kind of meaningful emphasis that suggested she was about to share information that would further reshape everyone's understanding of the situation. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Dr. Matthews clearly knew about the scholarship program, which meant she'd done more research into my background than I'd realized. The program was something I'd deliberately kept quiet, partly for privacy reasons and partly because I'd learned that public recognition of charitable activities often led to requests and expectations that complicated the original mission. "Oh," Patricia's eyebrows rose with renewed interest. "What kind of work?" Dr. Matthews looked at me with an expression that seemed to ask permission while simultaneously making it clear that she intended to proceed regardless of my preference. "The Rodriguez Education Foundation," she said, and I could see recognition dawning in several faces around our growing circle. The foundation name was familiar to anyone who followed educational philanthropy in our district, though the connection to my family name wasn't immediately obvious, since we'd deliberately structured it to maintain donor privacy. But Dr. Matthews had clearly done the research necessary to trace the funding sources back to their origin. Wait, Jennifer Chen said, her lawyer's mind making connections at impressive speed. The scholarship program that covers full college tuition for students from low-income families, that foundation? Among other educational initiatives, Dr. Matthews confirmed. Colonel Rodriguez has been quite active in supporting educational opportunities throughout our district. The gymnasium had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware that something significant was happening near the main fundraising table. Conversations continued, but at lower volumes, and I could sense the subtle shift in attention that occurs when community members realize they're witnessing something that might be worth remembering. How many scholarships? Susan Martinez asked, her business background apparently driving her toward quantifiable metrics. We don't typically discuss specific numbers, I said diplomatically, hoping to deflect the conversation away from details that I preferred to keep private. Over 200 students have received full 4-year scholarships through the Rodriguez Foundation, Dr. Matthews said, clearly deciding that discretion was less important than ensuring proper recognition. Plus funding for educational technology, teacher development programs, and infrastructure improvements at schools throughout the district. The numbers landed with visible impact. 200 full scholarships represented millions of dollars in educational investment, the kind of philanthropic commitment that transformed communities rather than just supporting them. It was also the kind of financial contribution that completely reframed assumptions about the quiet woman who'd been dismissed as a minor participant in the evening's activities. Patricia Whitmore was looking at me with an expression that suggested she was rapidly recalculating everything she thought she knew about school district politics and community influence. Jennifer Chen had gone completely still, her legal training probably telling her that she was in the presence of someone whose impact on local educational policy was significantly greater than she'd realized. 200 students? Patricia repeated, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was trying to process information that exceeded her existing frameworks for understanding community involvement. Full scholarships, Dr. Matthews emphasized, including living expenses, books, and additional support services. The foundation doesn't just pay for education, it provides comprehensive support to ensure student success. Why? The question came from one of the younger mothers who had joined our expanding circle, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the calculating assessment that I could see in some other faces. It was a fair question, and one that I'd been asked in various forms over the years since establishing the foundation. The answer was both simple and complicated, rooted in experiences that were difficult to explain without sharing more personal history than I typically revealed in casual conversations. Education changes everything, I said, offering the condensed version that usually satisfied curiosity without requiring extensive backstory. It opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. But why here? Why our district specifically? Dr. Matthews answered before I could respond. Colonel Rodriguez grew up in this district, she said, graduated from Jefferson High School before her military service. She's investing in the community that shaped her early development. That was true, though it was only part of the story. I had indeed graduated from Jefferson High, though my path to military service had been considerably more complicated than Dr. Matthews' summary suggested. The full story involved family financial struggles, limited post-secondary options, and a decision to enlist that had been driven more by necessity than ambition. But that background was also what made the scholarship program personally meaningful. I knew exactly what it felt like to have academic potential constrained by economic limitations, to watch classmates pursue educational opportunities that were simply not available to students whose families couldn't afford college costs. The foundation focuses particularly on first-generation college students, I added, providing context that might help explain the program's specific criteria. Students who have the academic ability but lack the family resources or guidance to navigate higher education independently. That's incredibly generous, the young mother said, and I could see genuine appreciation in her expression rather than the political calculation that was evident in some other faces. It's an investment, I corrected gently. Those students go on to become teachers, engineers, doctors, business owners. They strengthen the entire community. Dr. Matthews nodded approvingly. The economic impact analysis that the foundation commissioned showed that every scholarship dollar generates approximately $4 in regional economic benefit over the recipient's career, she said, clearly having done considerable research into the program's broader implications. I was impressed, despite myself. Dr. Matthews had obviously taken the time to understand not just the foundation's scope, but its measurable impact on regional development. That kind of comprehensive analysis suggested someone who viewed educational philanthropy through multiple lenses, rather than just appreciating it as charitable activity. "How do you select recipients?" Jennifer Chen asked, her professional instincts apparently driving her toward understanding the operational details. "Academic merit combined with financial need," I replied, "but we also look for students who demonstrate leadership potential and community engagement. Grade point average is important, but we're equally interested in character and commitment." "The selection process is quite rigorous," Dr. Matthews added. "Multiple interviews, essay requirements, community service documentation. The foundation wants to ensure that scholarships go to students who will maximize the investment." "Do you interview the candidates personally?" Patricia asked, and I could see that she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about my level of community involvement had been dramatically incorrect. "I review all applications personally," I confirmed, "and yes, I conduct final interviews for candidates who make it through the initial screening process." What I didn't mention was that those interviews were often the most rewarding part of my post-military life. Sitting across from 17 and 18-year-old students who reminded me of my younger self, seeing the combination of hope and uncertainty in their faces, understanding how much the scholarship opportunity meant to families who had worked so hard to create possibilities for their children. "That must be incredibly time-consuming," Susan Martinez observed, her business background probably calculating the hours involved in personally reviewing hundreds of applications and conducting dozens of interviews. "It's worth the investment," I said simply. Dr. Matthews was watching me with an expression that suggested she was debating whether to share additional information. She'd already revealed more about the foundation than I typically discussed in casual settings, but I could see that she was considering whether to provide even more context about my background. "The foundation is actually one of several initiatives," she said finally, making her decision to continue the revelations. "Colonel Rodriguez has also been instrumental in developing veteran transition programs, supporting military family services, and contributing to regional economic development projects." I felt that familiar desire to deflect attention away from detailed discussion of my philanthropic activities. The work was important, but it wasn't something I did for public recognition, and too much visibility often led to complications that interfered with the actual mission. "Community investment takes many forms," I said diplomatically, hoping to redirect the conversation away from a comprehensive catalog of foundation activities. But Dr. Matthews wasn't finished. "The Veteran Transition Program alone has helped over 300 former service members successfully integrate into civilian careers," she continued, clearly determined to ensure that my contributions received proper acknowledgement. "Job placement assistance, education benefits counseling, mental health support services, small business development loans." The numbers were adding up to paint a picture of community involvement that was considerably more extensive than anyone in the gymnasium had anticipated when the evening began. I could see parents recalculating their assumptions, not just about my background, but about the social dynamics that governed their own community. "How do you manage all of this?" Patricia asked, and for the first time since our conversation began, her tone carried genuine curiosity rather than political assessment. "Good organizational systems," I replied, which was true but inadequate. The reality was that managing multiple philanthropic initiatives required the same strategic planning and operational discipline that I'd learned during military service. But explaining that connection would require more detailed discussion of my background than I preferred to provide. "And considerable personal commitment," Dr. Matthews added. "The foundation's administrative costs are remarkably low because Colonel Rodriguez handles much of the strategic oversight personally." "Why keep it so quiet?" The question came from one of the fathers who had been listening intently to the entire conversation. "This kind of community investment deserves recognition." It was a reasonable question, though the answer touched on personal preferences that were difficult to explain without sounding either falsely modest or unnecessarily complicated. The truth was that I'd learned to value effectiveness over recognition, results over publicity. Recognition can sometimes interfere with mission accomplishment, I said, offering the condensed version that usually satisfied curiosity without requiring extensive explanation of my approach to community engagement. Military training, Dr. Matthews said with a knowing smile. Focus on the objective rather than personal credit. She wasn't wrong, though that explanation simplified what had actually been a gradual evolution in my thinking about philanthropic work. Early in my post-military career, I'd experimented with more public approaches to community investment, participating in charity galas and donor recognition events. But I'd discovered that visibility often came with social expectations and political complications that distracted from the actual work of helping students and veterans. Besides, I added, the students are what matter. Their success is the real measure of whether the programs are working. And they are working, Dr. Matthews confirmed. The scholarship recipients have a 96% college graduation rate, compared to the national average of 60% for first-generation college students. They're becoming doctors, teachers, engineers, entrepreneurs. They're transforming not just their own families, but entire communities. The statistics were impressive, though they represented more than just numbers to me. Each percentage point corresponded to individual students I'd interviewed, young people whose faces I could still remember, whose stories had convinced me that educational investment was one of the most effective forms of community development available. 96%, Jennifer Chen repeated, her lawyer's appreciation for compelling evidence evident in her tone. That's extraordinary. Comprehensive support makes the difference, I explained. It's not enough to just pay tuition. Students need mentoring, career guidance, sometimes emergency financial assistance for unexpected challenges. The foundation provides whatever support is necessary to ensure success. Like a military operation, Dr. Matthews observed, complete mission planning with contingency support for unexpected complications. The comparison was more accurate than she probably realized. I had indeed approached philanthropic work with many of the same strategic principles that governed military operations: clear objectives, comprehensive planning, dedicated resources, regular assessment of progress towards goals. Whatever works, I said with a slight smile, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd allowed myself since this conversation began. The gymnasium around us had continued its fundraising activities, but I was aware that our discussion had become something of a spectacle. Parents who had been focused on their own transactions were now glancing in our direction with obvious curiosity. And I could see that word of the evening's revelations was spreading through the volunteer network with impressive efficiency. Patricia Whitmore was looking at me with an expression that suggested she was rapidly reassessing not just my role in the evening's activities, but my potential value to future school district initiatives. I could practically see her mental gears turning as she calculated the implications of having someone with my resources and community connections available for PTA projects. "We should definitely talk more about potential collaboration opportunities," she said, her tone shifting to the kind of strategic friendliness that I recognized from countless similar conversations over the years. It was a predictable response, and one that illustrated exactly why I preferred to keep my philanthropic activities relatively quiet. Public recognition inevitably led to requests for additional involvement, invitations to serve on boards and committees, expectations about ongoing participation in community political processes. "I appreciate the interest," I said diplomatically, "but I found that my approach works best when it remains relatively independent." Dr. Matthews nodded understandingly. "Kearney Rodriguez prefers to focus on direct impact rather than committee work," she explains to Patricia with obvious approval. "Results over process." "But surely there are ways we could coordinate efforts," Patricia persisted, her PTA president instincts clearly driving her toward exploring every possible avenue for organizational collaboration. Shared resources, joint programming, strategic alignment of objectives. I could see that this conversation was heading toward exactly the kind of institutional entanglement that I'd spent years learning to avoid. Well-meaning community organizations had their own internal dynamics and political considerations that often complicated rather than enhanced philanthropic effectiveness. The foundation operates most efficiently when it maintains operational independence, I said, using the kind of polite but firm language that usually deflected requests for organizational merger without creating unnecessary conflict. Before Patricia could pursue the topic further, Dr. Matthews glanced at her watch and made a small sound of surprise. "I didn't realize how late it was getting," she said, though I suspected she was deliberately providing me with an exit opportunity. "Colonel Rodriguez, would you mind walking with me to my office? I'd love to show you some of the infrastructure improvements that the Foundation's grants have made possible." It was a graceful extraction offer, one that would allow me to end the increasingly complex public conversation while maintaining social courtesy. I accepted it gratefully. "Of course," I said, then turned to address the circle of parents who had been listening to our discussion. "Thank you for the warm welcome tonight. Emma's going to be thrilled that her class trip is so well supported." The comment served multiple purposes: acknowledging the evening's fundraising mission, reinforcing my connection to the school community through family ties, and providing a natural conclusion to a conversation that had grown considerably more complex than anyone had anticipated. As Dr. Matthews and I walked toward the gymnasium's exit, I could hear the conversations resuming behind us, though at a considerably higher volume than before. The evening's social dynamics had been permanently altered by the revelations about my background, and I suspected that Roosevelt Elementary's parent network would be processing this new information for weeks to come. "Thank you," I said quietly, as we reached the hallway outside the gymnasium. "For what?" Providing an exit strategy before that conversation became more complex than it needed to be. Dr. Matthews laughed, a genuine sound that carried both understanding and amusement. 22 years of military service teaches you to recognize when tactical withdrawal is the better part of valor," she said. "Besides, I genuinely do want to show you the computer lab renovations. The Foundation's technology grants have transformed our students' access to digital learning resources." As we walked through the elementary school's hallways, past displays of student artwork and bulletin boards celebrating academic achievements, I reflected on how the evening had evolved from a simple family obligation into something far more complex. The careful boundaries I'd maintained between my philanthropic work and my public presence in the community had been effectively dissolved by Dr. Matthews's recognition and subsequent revelations. It wasn't necessarily a negative development, but it would certainly require some adjustment in how I approached future school events and community interactions. The anonymous benefactor role that had served me so well was no longer available, at least not within this particular social network. But perhaps that change was overdue. The work was important enough to withstand public scrutiny, and the students who benefited from foundation programs deserved to have their stories told, even if that meant accepting more personal visibility than I'd originally intended. "Here's what I really wanted to show you," Dr. Matthews said as we reached her office, pulling out a thick folder filled with what appeared to be student letters and photographs. "These are from scholarship recipients who graduated last year. They wanted you to know how the Foundation's support had changed their lives." As I opened the folder and began reading the handwritten notes from students who had gone on to medical school, engineering programs, and teaching careers, I was reminded of why the work mattered more than any temporary discomfort with public recognition. The evening's complications suddenly seemed far less significant than the futures that had been made possible by educational investment and strategic philanthropy. The bake sale would end, the conversations would fade, but the impact would continue for generations. The student letters were written in the careful handwriting of young adults who understand the weight of gratitude, each one a testament to opportunities that might never have existed without foundation support. Maria Elena Vasquez wrote about her acceptance to medical school, describing how the scholarship had allowed her to focus on studies rather than working multiple jobs to pay for textbooks. James Chen, no relation to the Jennifer Chen from the bake sale, detailed his engineering internship at NASA, explaining how foundation mentoring had helped him navigate application processes that his parents, despite their love and support, couldn't guide him through as first-generation immigrants. They write these letters every year, Dr. Matthews said, settling into her chair behind a desk that bore the comfortable clutter of someone who prioritized substance over appearance. Not because we require them to, but because they want to. They understand that their success creates opportunities for future students. I continued reading through the folder, noting the diversity of academic paths and career trajectories represented in the letters. Teachers who were transforming classrooms in underserved communities, business owners creating jobs in their neighborhoods, social workers providing services to families facing the same challenges they had once navigated themselves. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual student success stories. "This is why the work matters," I said, carefully closing the folder after reading the last letter. "These young people are changing the world one decision at a time." "And they all trace their opportunities back to that interview process you mentioned," Dr. Matthews replied. "Several of them specifically wrote about how your questions during the selection interviews helped them clarify their own goals and develop confidence in their abilities." The interviews were indeed one of the most important parts of the Foundation's selection process, though not for reasons that most people understood. Academic transcripts and standardized test scores provided valuable information about student preparation and potential, but they didn't reveal character traits that often determined long-term success. The interview conversations allowed me to assess qualities like resilience, curiosity, and genuine commitment to using education as a tool for community improvement. "The questions aren't designed to be easy," I admitted. "We're looking for students who can think critically under pressure, who have developed their own perspectives rather than just absorbing information passively." "Like military training," Dr. Matthews observed, with a smile that suggested she was beginning to understand the connections between my service background and philanthropic approach. "Different context, same principles," I confirmed. "Leadership development requires challenge and support in equal measure." Dr. Matthews leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of analytical attention that suggested she was processing implications that extended beyond our immediate conversation. "You know, tonight's revelation is going to change how people in this community perceive both you and the Foundation's work." She was right, of course. The carefully maintained separation between my public presence and philanthropic activities had been permanently altered by the evening's events. Parents who had barely noticed me at previous school functions would now view me through completely different lenses, and that shift would inevitably affect future interactions. "Change isn't necessarily negative," I said, though I was still processing my own feelings about the loss of anonymity that had served me so well over the years. "No, it's not, but it will require some adjustment in how you navigate community relationships." Dr. Matthews paused, clearly considering her words carefully. "People like Patricia Whitmore mean well, but they operate in worlds where influence and recognition are closely connected. They may have difficulty understanding why someone with your resources would prefer to work quietly." It was an astute observation that revealed Dr. Matthews' sophisticated understanding of community politics and social dynamics. She recognized that my preference for operational independence wasn't false modesty or antisocial behavior, but rather a strategic choice based on experience with how public recognition could complicate philanthropic effectiveness. "I've learned to focus on outcomes rather than process," I said. "Sometimes that means avoiding activities that look productive but don't actually advance the mission." "Military efficiency applied to civilian challenges," she nodded approvingly. "It's refreshing, honestly. Too many well-intentioned community initiatives get bogged down in organizational politics rather than focusing on the people they're supposed to help." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us understanding that the evening's events had created a new dynamic that would require careful navigation. The Foundation's work would continue, but it would now operate in a different context, one where my personal involvement was public knowledge rather than private commitment. "What happens next?" Dr. Matthews asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in her voice about how I intended to manage the changed circumstances. "The work continues," I said simply. "The applications for next year's scholarships are already being processed. The Veteran Transition Program has a waiting list of participants. The infrastructure grants for technology improvements are being finalized for 3 additional schools. But you'll be doing it with considerably more community attention than before. That's true, though attention isn't necessarily problematic if it's focused on the right things. Dr. Matthews smiled at that response. Spoken like someone who's learned to manage complex situations without losing sight of primary objectives. As we prepared to leave her office and return to the gymnasium, I found myself reflecting on how the evening had unfolded in ways that no amount of planning could have anticipated. I'd arrived expecting to fulfill a simple family obligation, buy some overpriced baked goods, and leave with nothing more complicated than photographs to share with Maria during her hospital break. Instead, I was returning to a community event where my entire social position had been fundamentally altered by revelations that I'd spent years keeping carefully private. The parents and volunteers who had seen me as a minor figure in the evening's activities now understood that they'd been interacting with someone whose community impact far exceeded anything they'd initially imagined. When we returned to the gymnasium, the change in atmosphere was immediately apparent. Conversations didn't stop when we entered, but they shifted in subtle ways that suggested our earlier discussion had been thoroughly analyzed and disseminated throughout the parent network with impressive efficiency. Patricia Whitmore approached us almost immediately, her expression carrying the kind of determined friendliness that suggested she'd spent our absence developing strategies for future engagement. "Colonel Rodriguez, I hope you'll consider joining our planning committee for the spring fundraising gala," she said with obvious enthusiasm. "Your experience with event organization could be invaluable." It was exactly the kind of invitation I'd expected, and one that illustrated perfectly why I'd preferred to maintain operational independence. Community organizations invariably interpret philanthropic capacity as willingness to participate in their existing frameworks, even when those frameworks might not align with more effective approaches to achieving shared objectives. "I appreciate the invitation," I replied diplomatically, "but I've found that my contributions are most effective when they remain focused on direct student support rather than organizational activities." Jennifer Chen appeared at Patricia's shoulder, clearly having overheard the conversation. "But surely there are ways to coordinate efforts more efficiently," she said, her legal training apparently driving her toward exploring every possible avenue for systematic collaboration. Shared planning, resource optimization, strategic alignment of community objectives. I could see that this was going to be an ongoing challenge. Well-meaning community leaders who viewed my resources as potential solutions to their organizational needs, without necessarily understanding that effectiveness often required maintaining independence from existing institutional structures. "The foundation operates most efficiently when it focuses on its core mission," I explained patiently. "Educational support, veteran transition services, and infrastructure development. Additional commitments tend to dilute rather than enhance that focus." Dr. Matthews stepped smoothly into the conversation, providing institutional context that helped explain my position without requiring me to defend it repeatedly. "Colonel Rodriguez has developed systems that maximize impact through targeted intervention rather than broad organizational involvement," she said with obvious approval. "But think about the visibility benefits," Susan Martinez interjected, her real estate background apparently driving her toward marketing considerations. "Public recognition of your work could inspire other philanthropists to increase their own community investments." It was a reasonable point, though it missed some important nuances about how philanthropic work actually functioned most effectively. Publicity often attracted attention from people who were more interested in associating themselves with successful initiatives than in contributing meaningful resources or effort to expanding them. "Recognition can sometimes complicate mission accomplishment," I said, offering the same explanation I'd used earlier in the evening. "The foundation's effectiveness depends partly on its ability to operate without the constraints that come with high public visibility. Military operational security," Matthews added with a knowing smile. "Sometimes the most important work requires discretion rather than publicity." As the evening wound down and families began collecting their children and purchases, I found myself observing the subtle but unmistakable changes in how people interacted with me. Parents who had barely acknowledged my presence earlier were now making deliberate efforts to engage in conversation, their manner shifting from polite dismissal to respectful attention. The young mother whose toddler had experienced his memorable meltdown approached as I was preparing to leave. "I wanted to thank you again for helping earlier," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "And for everything you're doing for our community. I had no idea about the scholarship program." "The work speaks for itself," I replied, uncomfortable as always with personal credit for initiatives that involved so many other people's contributions. "My older daughter is a junior in high school," she continued. "She's been worried about college costs, but she's an excellent student. Would she be eligible to apply for foundation support?" "Applications open in January," I said, pulling out a business card that carried only basic contact information for the foundation. "The website has complete eligibility requirements and application procedures." As she thanked me and moved away, I realized that this conversation was probably being repeated throughout the gymnasium as parents processed the evening's revelations and began considering how they might apply to their own family circumstances. The foundation's deliberately low profile had been permanently altered, which would likely result in significant increases in application volume for next year's scholarship cycle. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly volunteer who had witnessed my handling of the earlier crisis, approached with the careful steps of someone who had spent decades navigating community social dynamics. "I've been volunteering at school events for 40 years," she said with a gentle smile, "and I've learned to recognize quality when I see it. Thank you for what you're doing for our young people." Her comment was simple but carried the weight of accumulated experience and genuine appreciation. Unlike the strategic friendliness of community leaders calculating potential collaborations, Mrs. Thompson's gratitude was rooted in understanding of how educational opportunities transformed individual lives and strengthened entire communities. "Education changes everything," I said, echoing the phrase I used earlier, but with deeper conviction born from years of watching scholarship recipients achieve goals that had once seemed impossible. "Yes, it does. And so do people who understand that investing in others is the best way to build a better world." As I finally made my way toward the gymnasium exit, I passed the joke board that Hollis had mentioned in the original story I'd analyzed. Roosevelt Elementary had its own version, a bulletin board where teachers posted amusing student comments and innocent misunderstandings that brought smiles during stressful days. But tonight, someone had pinned a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you, Colonel Rodriguez, for showing us that heroes live quietly among us." I carefully removed the note and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Recognition wasn't why I did the work, but acknowledgement of impact served as useful confirmation that resources were being deployed effectively toward meaningful objectives. The parking lot was nearly empty as I reached my vehicle. Most families had already departed with their fundraising purchases and stories about the evening's unexpected revelations. The gymnasium lights were still on, casting rectangular patches of yellow illumination across the asphalt, and I could see volunteers inside beginning the process of cleaning up after another successful community event. Maria would want to hear about how her tres leches cupcakes had performed in the competitive arena of elementary school fundraising, but she'd probably be more interested in learning about the social dynamics that had unfolded around my unexpected recognition. My sister had always understood better than most people why I preferred to keep different aspects of my life in separate compartments, and she'd probably find considerable amusement in how those boundaries had been dissolved by a combination of principal knowledge and community curiosity. As I drove home through quiet suburban streets lined with houses where families were probably discussing the evening's events over late dinners and homework supervision, I reflected on how a simple gesture of family support had evolved into something considerably more complex and potentially more significant. The Foundation's work would continue, but it would now operate in a different context, one where my personal involvement was public knowledge rather than private commitment. That change would require some adjustment in strategy and approach, but it wouldn't alter the fundamental mission of creating educational opportunities for students who possess the ability but lacked the resources to pursue higher education independently. If anything, the evening's events had reinforced my conviction that the work was important enough to withstand public scrutiny and community attention. The students whose letters I'd read in Dr. Matthews's office had achieved remarkable things precisely because they'd been given opportunities to develop their potential without being constrained by family economic circumstances. Those achievements spoke for themselves, regardless of whether the foundation's founder preferred anonymity or accepted public recognition. The impact was measurable, the outcomes were meaningful, and the mission was worthy of whatever personal adjustments might be required to ensure its continuation. 3 weeks later, I received an email from Patricia Whitemore informing me that Roosevelt Elementary's bake sale had raised more money than any previous fundraising event in the school's history. The email included a photograph of Emma's 6th grade class boarding a charter bus for their Washington, D.C. trip, all of them grinning with the excitement of young people embarking on an adventure that would expand their understanding of the world beyond their immediate community. Maria had framed one of the photos from the bake sale, not the one showing me in conversation with Dr. Matthews and the increasingly amazed parent volunteers, but a quieter image capturing me helping the young mother clean up after her son's spectacular meltdown. She'd placed it on her kitchen counter with a note that read, "This is who you really are." The foundation's application numbers had indeed increased dramatically following the evening's revelations, but so had the quality of applications as word spread through community networks about the comprehensive support provided to scholarship recipients. Teachers began encouraging their most promising students to apply. Guidance counselors developed better information systems about eligibility requirements, and families who had never considered college as a realistic possibility began planning for futures that had previously seemed unattainable. 6 months after the bake sale, I received a letter from Emma herself, written in the careful cursive that 6th graders learn to master. She thanked me for helping make her class trip possible, but more importantly, she wrote about how learning about the scholarship program had changed her own educational goals and given her confidence that college was something she could achieve if she worked hard enough. The letter was a reminder that impact often extends far beyond intended beneficiaries, creating ripple effects that transform entire family systems and community expectations. Emma would never need foundation support. Maria had built a successful career that would provide whatever educational resources her daughter required. But knowing that such opportunities existed had expanded Emma's sense of what was possible, which was perhaps the most valuable outcome of all. The evening that had begun as a simple family obligation had evolved into something that permanently altered how I understood the relationship between private commitment and public service. Anonymity had its advantages, but visibility could also serve important purposes when it helped people recognize that extraordinary contributions often come from unexpected sources. The work continued, the students succeeded, and the community grew stronger through the accumulated impact of individual achievements made possible by strategic investment in human potential. Recognition or anonymity, the mission remained the same, creating opportunities for young people to transform their lives through education and, through their success, to strengthen the communities that had shaped their early development. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that unfold quietly, without fanfare or publicity, in the space between private commitment and public impact. But sometimes those stories need to be told, if only to remind us that heroes often wear civilian clothes and fund their missions with scholarship checks rather than weapons.
The gymnasium lights at Roosevelt Elementary continue to shine on Tuesday evenings, illuminating fundraising events where parents gather to support their children's educational opportunities. And somewhere in that crowd, there's probably someone whose contributions extend far beyond what anyone realizes. Someone whose quiet commitment is changing lives in ways that won't be fully understood until years later, when scholarship recipients write letters of gratitude to benefactors whose names they may never learn. The most effective service often requires no recognition at all. But when recognition comes, the measure of its worth lies not in personal satisfaction, but in the inspiration it provides to others who might be moved to serve their own communities with similar commitment and strategic vision. In the end, we all have opportunities to invest in futures that extend beyond our own immediate concerns. The question isn't whether we have the resources to make a difference, but whether we have the commitment to use whatever resources we possess in ways that strengthen the communities and support the people who will shape tomorrow's possibilities. The bake sale ended, but the impact continues. One scholarship at a time, one student at a time, one transformed life at a time. 2 years have passed since that transformative evening at Roosevelt Elementary, and the landscape of my community involvement has shifted in ways I never anticipated when I walked into that fluorescent-lit gymnasium carrying nothing more than good intentions and a promise to my sister. The scholarship applications now arrive in boxes rather than envelopes, requiring additional staff to process the overwhelming response from families who had never before believed that higher education was within their financial reach. What began as a modest program supporting a handful of exceptional students each year has expanded into a comprehensive educational ecosystem that touches hundreds of lives annually. Last month, I stood in the same gymnasium where my carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered by Dr. Matthews's recognition. But this time I was there by invitation rather than obligation. Roosevelt Elementary was hosting its first annual Community Heroes Recognition Evening, and despite my continued preference for working behind the scenes, I had reluctantly agreed to accept their Distinguished Service Award. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once been dismissed as an unremarkable civilian contractor was now being honored as an exemplary community leader. But the real revelation of that return visit wasn't my own transformation from invisible relative to recognized philanthropist. It was seeing Emma Martinez, now an 8th grader, presenting her science fair project on sustainable energy solutions with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that her educational goals were achievable. During my brief acceptance speech, I looked out at an audience that included many of the same faces from that pivotal bake sale evening. Patricia Whitmore sat in the front row, her expression reflecting genuine respect rather than the calculating politeness I remembered from our first encounter. Jennifer Chen had become one of the Foundation's volunteer legal advisors, contributing her expertise to scholarship contract development without the aggressive networking approach that had initially characterized her interest. But it was Mrs. Thompson's presence that moved me most deeply. Now in her 80s and moving more slowly than she had 2 years earlier, she had insisted on attending the ceremony despite her family's concerns about the evening schedule. When I mentioned her kindness during that long-ago crisis with the overwhelmed toddler, she stood slowly and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see community investment bear meaningful fruit. The Foundation's impact has extended far beyond individual scholarship recipients to influence regional educational policy and community development strategies. Universities throughout the state now actively recruit students from our district, recognizing that Foundation-supported scholars consistently outperform their peers in both academic achievement and post-graduation career success. Maria tells me that Emma speaks regularly about her intention to establish her own scholarship program once she completes her medical degree, a goal that seemed impossibly ambitious to a 6th grader but now feels entirely attainable to a young woman who has watched her aunt demonstrate that strategic philanthropy can reshape entire communities. The Veteran Transition Program has evolved into a model that other regions are beginning to replicate, with former participants now serving as mentors for newly transitioning service members. What started as job placement assistance has grown into a comprehensive support network that addresses everything from housing stability to entrepreneurship development to mental health services. Perhaps most significantly, the evening's revelations sparked a broader conversation about hidden contributions within our community. Teachers began sharing stories about parents who volunteered countless hours without seeking recognition, business owners quietly funding classroom supplies and field trips, retirees using their professional expertise to mentor struggling students. The assumption that community impact required public visibility was replaced by a deeper appreciation for the power of strategic, sustained engagement. Dr. Matthews retired last year, but before leaving her position, she established a tradition of community impact spotlights that recognize quiet contributors whose work might otherwise remain invisible. Her replacement continues this practice, understanding that communities thrive when they acknowledge the full spectrum of service, rather than only the most visible forms of involvement. The bake sale that changed everything has become a district legend, referenced in PTA meetings and school board discussions as an example of how assumptions about community members can limit our understanding of available resources and potential partnerships. New parents receive orientation materials that emphasize the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when building relationships within the school community. My own journey from military service to strategic philanthropy continues to evolve, shaped by lessons learned in both combat zones and elementary school gymnasiums. The skills that once focused on mission completion in hostile environments now concentrate on creating opportunities in supportive communities. But the underlying principles remain remarkably consistent: clear objectives, comprehensive planning, dedicated resources, and unwavering commitment to achieving meaningful results. The Foundation's work will outlast my personal involvement, sustained by endowments that ensure perpetual funding and guided by governance structures that maintain focus on educational equity and veteran support. The young people whose college degrees hang in frames beside their scholarship certificates are already establishing their own philanthropic initiatives, creating a generational cycle of community investment that extends far beyond my original vision. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Dr. Matthews hadn't recognized me that evening, if I had successfully maintained my anonymous presence at Emma's fundraising event. The work would have continued, certainly, but perhaps without the community connections that have enhanced its effectiveness and expanded its reach. The truth is that recognition, even unwanted recognition, can serve purposes that transcend personal comfort zones. Visibility creates accountability, inspires emulation, and demonstrates that extraordinary impact often comes from ordinary-seeming people who simply choose to use their resources strategically rather than selfishly. The elementary school gymnasium still hosts monthly fundraising events, though they now operate with considerably more sophisticated organizational systems than the one I observed that transformative Tuesday evening. Parents approach these gatherings with deeper appreciation for the diverse talents and resources that exist within their community, understanding that assumptions about capability and commitment can blind us to remarkable potential hiding in plain sight. Emma graduated from Roosevelt Elementary last spring, carrying with her not just academic knowledge, but a fundamental understanding that education represents possibility rather than privilege. Her journey toward medical school continues, supported by family love and community investment, guided by examples of service that emphasize substance over recognition. The most enduring lesson of that unexpected evening remains relevant far beyond the specific context of school fundraising or military to civilian transitions. We are surrounded by people whose contributions exceed their apparent circumstances, whose quiet commitment shapes our communities in ways we rarely recognize until circumstance reveals the full scope of their engagement. The next time you attend a community event, look beyond the obvious leaders and vocal participants. Notice the people who volunteer without seeking credit, who solve problems without claiming recognition, who invest in others without expecting acknowledgement. They are the ones who truly build stronger communities, one relationship at a time, one opportunity at a time, one transformed life at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.